January 17th, 1943. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel. In the pre-dawn darkness, the USS Skipjack, a Gato-class submarine, sat low in the water like a predator preparing to slip beneath the surface. Her hull gleamed with condensation under the dock lights, and the gentle lapping of waves against her flanks provided the only sound in those final moments before departure. Sailors moved with practiced efficiency across her deck, their boots creating a rhythmic cadence against the metal plating. Below, in the cramped forward torpedo room, wedged between two Mark 14 torpedoes and hidden beneath a pile of canvas tarps that smelled of mildew and grease, a 16-year-old boy named Calvin Graham held his breath and waited for the diesel engines to roar to life. He had no right to be there, no authorization, no orders, just a forged birth certificate that said he was 18, a desperate hunger to prove himself, and the absolute certainty that comes only to the young, that he belonged exactly where he shouldn't be. The story of how a child came to hide aboard a war-bound submarine in the third year of the Second World War requires understanding what America had become by the winter of 1943. The attack on Pearl Harbor had transformed a nation. In living rooms from Maine to California, families gathered around radio sets each evening, listening to Edward R. Murrow's voice crackling across thousands of miles, describing a world being torn apart. Young men lined up at recruitment stations with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction. The war was not something distant, not an abstraction discussed in newspapers. It was personal, immediate, and all-consuming. But there existed a particular breed of boy in those years, too young for the draft, too restless for patience, who saw their older brothers and fathers disappear into uniform and felt the war passing them by. Calvin Graham was one of these. Born in Canton, Texas, in 1926, he had grown up during the Great Depression watching his family struggle. His father had died when he was young. His mother worked herself hollow trying to feed 6 children. By 12, Calvin was selling newspapers on Houston street corners, his voice hoarse from shouting headlines about Nazi advances across Europe and Japanese expansion in the Pacific. By 14, he had made his decision. By 15, he had altered his birth certificate with India ink and a steady hand. By 16, he had convinced a Navy recruiter that he was old enough to fight. The Navy had accepted him. What they didn't know, what nobody aboard the Skipjack knew that January morning, was that their newest crew member had never finished the training he was supposed to complete. When orders came through for the submarine to depart ahead of schedule, Calvin had been in the middle of basic instruction at San Diego. But he had seen the Skipjack's name on the departure roster, and something in him had snapped. Perhaps it was fear that the war would end before he could prove himself. Perhaps it was the desperate need to feel worthy, to contribute, to matter in a world where he had spent his entire childhood feeling invisible. Whatever the reason, he had stolen away from his barracks in the middle of the night, hitchhiked to Pearl Harbor, and in the confusion of final preparation for departure, slipped aboard when no one was looking. Now, as the submarine's engines coughed and rumbled to life, sending vibrations through every rivet and weld in her hull, Calvin felt the vessel begin to move. The canvas above him shifted. Light spilled in. A face appeared, grizzled, weathered, belonging to a chief petty officer whose expression cycled rapidly through surprise, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the chief breathed. "How old are you, kid?" 18, sir," Calvin lied, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. The chief stared at him for a long moment. Above them, the Skipjack was already clearing the harbor, heading toward open water. Turning back now would mean delays, reports, complications. The chief's weathered face twisted with an emotion Calvin couldn't quite read. "You picked one hell of a boat to stow away on, son. We're heading to the Solomon Islands. You understand what that means?" Calvin nodded, though he didn't. Not really. Not yet. What it meant was that the Skipjack was being deployed to one of the most dangerous theaters of the Pacific War. The waters around the Solomon Islands had become a graveyard for ships of all nations, a stretch of ocean so littered with wrecks that sailors had begun calling it Iron Bottom Sound. Japanese destroyers prowled those depths with lethal efficiency. Their submarine hunters had become increasingly sophisticated, increasingly deadly. The skipjack would be hunting Japanese cargo vessels and warships, yes, but she would also be hunted in return. The submarine war in the Pacific was nothing like the gentleman's conflict that naval theorists had imagined before the war. It was claustrophobic, terrifying, and utterly merciless. American submarines stalked Japanese shipping lanes, surfacing at night to attack convoys, diving deep when patrol boats came searching. The Japanese response had been to develop increasingly effective anti-submarine tactics. Their depth charges had grown more powerful, their patrol patterns more unpredictable. Their willingness to spend hours, sometimes days, hunting a single submarine was absolute. For the crew of the skipjack, life became a strange routine of tension and tedium. Days would pass in relative calm, the submarine cruising at periscope depth, her crew performing the endless maintenance that kept her operational. Then would come moments of pure terror, the sudden order to dive, the rush to battle stations, the awful waiting as enemy destroyers passed overhead, their propellers churning the water into chaos. Calvin learned quickly. The crew, initially resentful of the stowaway who had complicated their mission, gradually accepted him. There was something about the kid's willingness to do any job, no matter how unpleasant, that won them over. He cleaned bilges. He hauled supplies. He learned to read the maze of pipes and valves that lined every surface of the submarine's interior. Most importantly, he learned to be silent during depth charge attacks, to lie in his bunk and control his breathing while the ocean tried to crush them all. The first attack came on February 3rd, 3 weeks into their patrol. The skipjack had surfaced at dawn to recharge her batteries when a lookout spotted a Japanese destroyer on the horizon. The dive alarm sounded, a klaxon shriek that sent every man scrambling to his station. Calvin, assigned to the forward torpedo room, felt the submarine angle sharply downward, the deck tilting beneath his feet as the skipjack plunged toward safety. But the destroyer had seen them. Through the hydrophones, the underwater listening devices that were a submarine's ears, they could hear the enemy ship's propellers growing louder, faster, bearing down on their position. The captain ordered silent running. Every non-essential system was shut down. Men froze at their posts, barely breathing. The submarine drifted in the current like a dead thing, hoping to become invisible. The first depth charge exploded 200 yards away. The sound was unlike anything Calvin had ever experienced. Not a bang or a boom, but a crushing concussion that seemed to compress reality itself. The submarine shuddered. Light bulb shattered. A pipe cracked somewhere aft, spraying water until someone managed to shut the valve. Calvin's ears rang. His hand shook. But around him, the veteran crew remained calm with that particular calmness that comes only from having survived this before and knowing that panic kills faster than depth charges. More explosions followed. Closer now. The Japanese destroyer was patterning them, dropping charges in a grid, tightening the noose. In the control room, the captain studied his charts with an expression that revealed nothing. They were at 400 feet, approaching the skipjack's crush depth. Going deeper meant risking the submarine's hull. Staying here meant letting the destroyer narrow its search. What happened next has been recorded in the skipjack's official log, though the full story remained classified for 30 years after the war. In the forward torpedo room, as another depth charge exploded near enough to knock men off their feet, Calvin Graham noticed something. The torpedoes in their racks, massive weapons weighing over 3,000 pounds each, were secured with heavy chains to prevent them from shifting during attacks. But the chains themselves, hanging between the torpedoes and the bulkhead, were creating a distinctive metallic rattling each time a depth charge went off. To a 16-year-old who had grown up in poverty, who had learned to notice small things because missing them meant going hungry, the sound was obvious. To veteran submariners who had been trained to think in terms of systems and procedures, it was invisible, just part of the cacophony of noise that accompanied depth charge attacks. Calvin approached the chief petty officer and whispered his observation. The torpedoes were singing. Each explosion made the chains vibrate, and those vibrations were being transmitted through the hull into the water. The Japanese destroyer's hydrophone operators were almost certainly using that noise to track them. The chief stared at him. Then, without a word, he began wrapping the chains with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. Other torpedo men saw what he was doing and joined in, moving quickly but quietly, muffling every potential source of noise in the compartment. The process took less than 5 minutes. When they finished, the forward torpedo room had gone from being a percussion instrument to being a tomb. The next depth charge exploded. The submarine shook, but the metallic singing had stopped. Above them, invisible through hundreds of feet of dark water, the Japanese destroyer made another pass. Then another. The crew waited, breathing shallow breaths, counting seconds that stretched into minutes. The destroyer's propeller noise began to fade. 15 minutes later, it was gone entirely. The skipjack remained at depth for another 2 hours before the captain finally gave the order to surface. When they broke into daylight and cracked the hatches, letting fresh air flood into the submarine's stale interior, Calvin Graham was still shaking. Not from fear, though he had been terrified, but from the realization of how close they had come to dying. The captain called him to the control room that evening. The entire crew was watching. In a cramped space that smelled of sweat and diesel and recycled air, the captain looked at this boy who shouldn't have been there and said something that would be repeated in naval training schools for generations afterward. "Son, you might be too young to be here legally, but you've got the instincts of a submariner. That stunt with the torpedo chains probably saved this boat." Calvin didn't know how to respond. He had expected punishment, perhaps confinement, maybe court-martial when they returned to Pearl Harbor. Instead, he was being thanked, accepted, recognized not as a child playing at war, but as a member of the crew who had contributed to their survival. The skipjack continued her patrol for another month. They sank 2 Japanese cargo ships and damaged a destroyer before finally returning to Hawaii in March. When they docked, the full truth of Calvin Graham's age and circumstances emerged. The Navy was furious. Regulations had been violated. Protocols ignored. There was talk of punishment, of making an example. But the war was not interested in regulations. America needed submariners. The Pacific Fleet was growing at an unprecedented rate, and experienced crew members were worth more than adherence to peacetime rules. After weeks of bureaucratic wrestling, the Navy reached a compromise. Calvin would be allowed to remain in service until the war ended, but he would never be promoted, never receive veterans' benefits, and his service would remain unofficial. He accepted these terms without complaint and was transferred to the battleship USS South Dakota, where he would serve in the gun crews during multiple Pacific campaigns, including the naval battle of Guadalcanal. There, in November 1943, he would be wounded by shrapnel when Japanese shells tore through his battle station, earning him a Purple Heart that the government would later try to strip from him when his true age was discovered. But all of that lay in the future. For now, standing on the dock at Pearl Harbor as the skipjack prepared for a next patrol without him, Calvin Graham looked back at the submarine that had been his home for 2 months and understood something fundamental about the nature of war and belonging. The symbolic weight of those torpedo chains, wrapped in cloth by men who understood that survival depends on recognizing what others overlook, will become a metaphor that Navy instructors would use for decades. In submarine warfare, they would teach the smallest sound can mean the difference between life and death. Vigilance isn't about grand gestures or heroic charges. It's about noticing the chain that's rattling, the valve that's dripping, the gauge that's reading slightly wrong. It's about paying attention when everyone else is too experienced to see what's in front of them. There was something distinctly American about Calvin Graham's story, though it would take years for historians to articulate exactly what. Here was a boy from nothing, no wealth, no connections, no advantages, who had forced his way into a war he wasn't supposed to fight and then save his ship through simple observation and common sense. It wasn't technology that had defeated the Japanese destroyer's depth charges. It wasn't superior training or equipment. It was a teenage newspaper boy noticing that chains make noise. The American submarine service would go on to compile one of the most devastating records of any fighting force in World War II. Operating primarily in the Pacific, American submarines would sink over 50% of all Japanese merchant shipping, strangling the island nation's ability to move resources, troops, and supplies. They would sink more Japanese warships than all other American forces combined. And they would do it while suffering the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military, with 1 in 5 submariners never returning home. But the effectiveness of the submarine force wasn't just about technology or numbers. It was about the culture that developed aboard those boats, a culture of meritocracy where age and rank mattered less than competence, where good ideas could come from anyone, where survival depended on every crew member contributing to the collective intelligence of the vessel. The hierarchical rigidity that characterized much of military life dissolved in the cramped confines of submarine. Officers and enlisted men ate the same food, breathed the same recycled air, faced the same dangers. There was no room for pretense when everyone's life depended on everyone else. This was the democratization of warfare in its purest form. It stood in stark contrast to the authoritarian militaries that America faced across both oceans. In the German Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Navy, strict hierarchy was religion. Orders flowed downward and were never questioned. Initiative at lower ranks was discouraged. The idea that a 16-year-old boy might offer a suggestion that could save an entire vessel would have been not just unlikely, but culturally impossible. The recurring symbol in Calvin Graham's story isn't a weapon or food, but sound itself, or rather, its absence. In submarine warfare, silence was survival. The wrapped chains represented the American philosophy of war. Pragmatic, innovative, willing to challenge assumptions, and fundamentally democratic in its willingness to listen to wisdom regardless of its source. Where authoritarian navies might have court-martialed a junior crew member for suggesting that experienced officers had missed something obvious, the skipjack's chief petty officer had simply wrapped the chains and moved on. Years after the war ended, when Calvin Graham's story finally became public, reporters would ask him what he remembered most about his time aboard the skipjack. They expected tales of combat, of fear overcome, of patriotic fervor. Instead, he talked about the silence during depth charge attacks, how every man became completely still, how you could hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the tiny creaks and groans of the submarine's hull as it endured pressures it was never designed to withstand. How in those moments of absolute quiet, rank and age disappeared entirely, and everyone was just a human being hoping to see another sunrise. The epilogue of Calvin Graham's war service was less triumphant than it should have been. After being wounded aboard the South Dakota, his true age was discovered. The Navy discharged him dishonorably in 1943, denied him his benefits, and confiscated his medals. He spent years fighting to have his service recognized, finally winning his Purple Heart back in 1978, 35 years after he earned it. The Navy Board for Correction of Naval Records officially changed his discharge to honorable in 1994, 7 months after his death from heart failure at age 68. But the story of the boy who wrapped torpedo chains in cloth transcended the injustice of his treatment. It became legend in the submarine service, passed down through generations of submariners as an object lesson in the value of fresh perspectives and the danger of experience-induced blindness. Naval Academy instructors would use it to teach young officers about the importance of listening to their crew. Submarine commanders would reference it when emphasizing the collective nature of underwater warfare. The deeper truth embedded in this story has nothing to do with submarines or depth charges and everything to do with the nature of the American experiment itself. Democracy is noisy, messy, argumentative, inefficient, constantly questioning itself. But when it works, when it actually functions as intended, democracy notices the rattling chains. It wraps them in cloth not because some manual dictates it, but because someone paid attention and spoke up and was heard. In January 1943, A child hiding beneath canvas tarps in a submarine's torpedo room represented everything fragile about America's war effort. The desperate improvisation, the shortage of trained personnel, the willingness to bend rules in pursuit of victory. But he also represented everything powerful about American democracy. The belief that wisdom can emerge from unexpected sources, that hierarchy must sometimes yield to insight, that the newest voice might speak the most important truth. The Skipjack would complete 11 war patrols before the end of World War II, sinking multiple enemy vessels and earning 4 battle stars. She would never be hit by a depth charge during her entire service. Some of that was luck, some was skill, and some, though official records would never acknowledge it, was because of cloth-wrapped chains and a 16-year-old boy who noticed what others couldn't hear. In the end, the sound of those wrapped chains, or rather, their silence, became the sound of American abundance in its truest form. Not material wealth, though America had that in overwhelming measure. Not technological superiority, though that too played its role. But the abundance of possibility, the democratic luxury of believing that anyone, regardless of age or rank or background, might be the one who saves the ship. That belief, more than any weapon system or industrial capacity, was what the Skipjack carried into battle. And it was what Calvin Graham, the boy who shouldn't have been there, helped her bring home again.